Okay, hi.
My name is Richard B. Highbaugh. I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana. Went through elementary and high school there. And after high school, I finished in 1939, Crispus Attucks High School. I worked on the NYA program and went to Indiana University Extension and finished 2 years of work and 3 years at it. And I was in class 1A, July the 1st, 1941. And I had intimated to the draft board at that time that I was an applicant for the Air Corps. Air Corps in those days later became the Air Force. And along came Pearl Harbor. And then this meant that I really had to start pushing buttons and taking, I'd already had one or two cursory exams, took another exam at Purdue University. It's the first week of January 1942. And I was drafted into the Army in a signal construction company in September of '42. Now I've applied for the Air Force training to be an aviation cadet at Tuskegee, but 9 months later I was drafted, and I was in that signal construction company until February of '43. Now they finished their work, which was just about finished when I left them in California, Mather Field in California, and I was called in the 1st of March, 1943, to go down to Tuskegee. They sent, believe it or not, a telegram to my home, Indianapolis, Indiana, to my mother, asking her where I was and telling her that my application was now active and for me to report, you know, to get permission to report. Well, I went in, and the commander, the battalion commander in the Signal Corps said, now this was the last week or so of December, '42, he said, "Oh, you want to go down to Tuskegee and get killed?" I said, "No, sir. I want to go down to Tuskegee to learn to fly and participate in their activities in the service." They said, "We'll let you know when we're ready for you to go." So
originally, what got you interested in getting
what got me interested? Yeah. All right. Now, I'm old enough to remember when Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. That was 1927. I was born in 1920. And the newspapers were full, and parents, we all talked. Plus the fact that in those days, airplanes went so slow that I lived in a suburb called Irvington, and in the warm weather, good weather, people would yell, "An airplane going over." Children, everybody, if we were out of school, would run outside to see the airplane. Indianapolis had an airport. The last name in the airport was Cook. It's now Indianapolis International Municipal Airport. But we went out there and we got to see airplanes taking off and landing. And then another friend of mine who had died within the last year, a little bit older than I am, built an airplane, and this man actually flew it. Now, he flew this airplane after the war, but he was an aviator in his mind. Now, the final thing that got me involved, there was a member in the first class, DeBow, Charles DeBow, was about 3 years ahead of me in high school, and I knew Charles's family. I didn't know Charles at that time, but Charles was in the first class at Tuskegee, and then 2 classes behind Charles, there was another Indianapolis fellow named George Knox. And George, we all knew his mother, Sue Knox. She was a very eloquent lady who was known in political circles there and would help you. Matter of fact, Ms. Knox signed a letter for me to help me get in the Air Corps then at the time. And I would say that there were about 15 of us from Indianapolis in the program. But now, getting away from that, I was raised in a community where there were maybe 60,000 or 70,000 people, but there were probably less than 1,000 African-American families.
What was that like growing up?
Well, they were all okay, but just let me make this one point,
Okay.
that a number of those fellows flew, both as enlisted men and pilots. And they were actually leaving before my brother and I did. And we wanted to get in there and fly too. Now, getting back to how this neighborhood affected me, I consider it a plus. My mother had grown up in that neighborhood, and some of the children, white children in the neighborhood, we were friendly with because they knew my parents, and although she wasn't on a social level with them, we went to a black church, and our social activities were, of course, in our neighborhood. But flying was something that was kind of mysterious. You wanted to do it. We also read and knew about Amelia Earhart, and although she got lost later, of course, than when Lindbergh flew. Now, there were many tragedies among whites, losses. There was a bicycle group that my brother rode with. His name was Earl Burton Highbaugh. Now, they did 2 80-mile rides Saturday and Sunday. Now, I'm going to tell you a story about that because I would start out with them and ride maybe 15 miles out and wave goodbye, and I'm on my way back home. But these fellows were really bicycle riders. Of course, Bert did not go to the Olympics, but one of the young men in that group went to the Olympics in '36. That was the caliber of riding they were doing. And to get off the bicycle thing, one other thing, that Bert worked up to a 26-pound bicycle. No coasters. You ran and jumped on it. When you stopped it to get off, you stopped and got off, and they were great. But there were many of those youngsters lost. One mother there that my mother had been, I should remember her name but do not, lost 3 sons. Another lady around the corner from us, I do remember their names, Rollins. We were in school with them also. She lost 2. Her brother lost 1, so that family lost 3. Now, all of those 6 youngsters were all in the Air Corps. All of them were not pilots, but they were in the Air Corps in various activities. I won't say I accepted my situation and position in the community. There were errands to run and jobs to do, and you could get a Saturday job working from 8 in the morning to 4 or 5 o'clock on Saturday. And the basic wage, don't laugh, 25 cents an hour. Now that meant there was basic, but everybody you worked for didn't give you a quarter an hour. You didn't leave there with $2 from everybody. You may left with $1.50. And we did have some white friends. We all went to the same elementary schools, and the teachers knew us by the fact that my mother and her brothers and sisters had gone to that school. And so there were no really sad, upsetting, untoward incidents in Irvington as I knew about. However, in the past in Irvington where I was raised, there was a man named D.C. Stevenson. Now, D.C. Stevenson's time was probably from the late teens until he was convicted of murdering a young white woman. I'd say that was 22 or 23. I don't remember this. This is hearsay. But I do know where D.C. Stevenson lived. However, I never saw a cross or heard of anybody being beaten or burned or lynched. But Indiana, the state of Indiana, it was a little different. In a town called Elwood, Indiana, about 50 miles north from us, in 1930. An uncle called me in one day to just said, "Richard, I got something I want to read to you in the paper." I said, "Yes, sir." No days it was, "Sir," if he was your uncle and a year older than you. Of course, this man was 10 years older, but you jumped. When he said jump, you jumped. He read this article to me, and I think everybody knows that story. They tried to get 3 boys one escaped, and they did lynch 2 boys in Elwood. And now that was when I was 10, I remember that. That was a real sad incident. Indianapolis was a segregated city. The churches were segregated, the movie houses, the eating places, and things like that were all segregated. However, I did have a mother who was very eloquent, a lady and a creative lady mentally. Now this is much later, I'm talking about late 30s now. She helped to integrate one of the big store restaurants in Indianapolis because she, as I said, had gone to school with some people who by then were up and about and doing things. So they had a little group, and I remember this actually happened. They decided to go to a restaurant in one of these stores. The whites went in first and reserved 2 tables. There were about 6 or 8 of them, and they sat at 2 tables. And then the fun starts. 15 or 20 minutes after they were in there, along came whomever else. These people started waving and said, "Here we are over here, come on over here and join us. We've got reserved places." The manager came out and said, "You've got what?" He said, "Oh yes." I said, "You've already said these are the people that we reserved for." Now, there was no pushing, no arrests or anything. Some of those people stayed that day and had the meals, others did not. But that was the beginning of the change in eating places in Indianapolis. This was about, I'd say, 37 or 38. So my mother was a leader in that course. And just a small incident in my lifetime. Although we went to white elementary schools, my mother had gone to the same school that I started into. I was late starting because I was ill. January 1927, Mama and Richard went to the school to go in. Principal's name was Mrs. Funk. And Mrs. Funk met her at the door and said, "Margrave," knew her. Now, Mama hadn't graduated that many years before. And as a matter of fact, I had an aunt in the school in the 8th grade, my mother's baby sister. We've decided that we'll have no more colored children. Mama said, "You what?" "We're not going to have any more colored children." Now, in the school then, I'm estimating that there were probably 15 or 20 in that school at that time. Number 57 in Indianapolis. So Mama and I we went to school every day, and we sat on the steps outside the school for 2.5 weeks. Well, in the meantime, this school was on a street called Washington Street, which was the old Highway 40. A lot of traffic. And there was a policeman who passed that school every day on his way to work downtown Indianapolis. Now, we were 5500 East, this suburb. So he called the school board one day, and he said, "I've been seeing this mother and this little boy out there." He said, "I wonder why they aren't in school." The school board says, "We will investigate that." And they did, and they called the school, and the joke of the situation that we heard, now see, I was 7 then, 6.5 or 7. Now, the joke was that Mrs. Funk did not know about us. We know that wasn't true. But I would say within the next week, I was in the 1st grade. The school board said, whatever she was doing wrong, you can't do that. And then I must emphasize this peculiar situation now, that there was already one African-American girl in the 1st grade, and there were few others scattered, and I had an aunt who was in the 8th grade. So what Mrs. Funk went through, we don't know. Well, that was just a peculiar situation. One more thing I'll say on my schooling in Indianapolis was that my mother and father both were raised in that town. My father was born in Indianapolis, my mother born in Kentucky. and they went to public high schools and public elementary schools. Now, in Indianapolis, there were about 3 or 4 literally segregated elementary schools because they were in all black communities. However, all of the youngsters had to go to the 5 or 6 scattered high schools. Well, the board came up with a proposition to the community that if you will allow us to build a black high school, and this will involve some of the people who would be teaching there, but it'll mean that all of the black or African American children in the area will have to go to Crispus Attucks High School. Well, obviously some, including my mother, were against that. They wrote letters and had some meetings in churches, but they lost. So by the time I came along, finishing elementary school in '35, all black children went to Crispus Attucks. Now that's how I knew about DeBow and Charles Knox, because unless you went to the Catholic high school, and I've forgotten the name of that school, and if you went to high school in Indianapolis, you were African American. From the fall of '27 until 1951 or 52, you went to Attucks. One little bit of an exception. I had another aunt who was a little bit ahead in school of this baby sister of my mother's. She had already started in Tech High School at the time Attucks was built. Well, the city gave them a break. They said, all of the students who are in high school now, you can go to Attucks or not. If you want to stay in the school you're in, fine. So this aunt, and she's still living, she's 89 now, she's still living, she decided to stay at Tech. But a number of the kids who were already in high school went to Attucks. So that's just a little overview of things that I remember.
Well, can we talk about your Tuskegee experience? Now, you weren't recruited, you just applied for the...
Well, yes. Now, my Tuskegee experience, I said I got down there 1st or 2nd of March, 1943. Mm-hmm. And the class that I was enrolled in was called 43K, mm-hmm. which was the last month of December. We graduated December the 5th, 1943. And we were... maybe Bob can correct me on this, but we were the second to the last of what they call the pegboard classes. Now, when we went in, as I remember, the coordination and some of the exams we had were exams that had been given even as late as the late 20s all through the 30s, mm-hmm. and up into the 40s. Now later, the cadets who came in after one class after ours, who came in, they went through a battery of electronic exams, which would really, I think, classify them a little bit better physically, maybe mentally and whatnot, than we did. They went to Biloxi, Mississippi to a classification school that was set up there. Now here's something kind of unique that happened to us. My brother, who was at Hampton Institute at the time, came home, and he and I was from California and he was from Hampton, Virginia. We were home about 3 or 4 days together. We left home the same day, but going different places. He went to Mississippi and I went to Tuskegee. So his cadet days started at Biloxi, and I went to the base. There were some humorous things that happened. I made an error, and having been a sergeant for maybe 60 days in the Signal Corps, I thought that it would be to my advantage to show up at Tuskegee with sergeant chevrons. That was 110% wrong, not 100% wrong. Oh, those upperclassmen loved that. They said, why, we have a sergeant, I'll bet he knows how to drill. So what they would do put me in a corner of the room, and one would sit about where you are, reading a book or doing whatever, and I would be drilling the platoon, which would be the corner of the room. And one of my upperclassmen then told me, he said, those chevrons are still on your blouse, are they? I said, yes. He said, well, take them off today. He said, you had absolutely no right to come down here. He said, although you've been in the Army, but you were projecting the wrong image when you came here as a cadet, expecting that situation to help you on the surface. Now, it definitely helped me otherwise, because I had been in the Army for 8 or 9 months and I knew a little bit about it. Our upper class was a 43J, and J had a wee bit of a trauma. We were the second class at Tuskegee that had twin engine training. Approximately half of our class were fighters and half twin engine. 43J, November of 43, was the first class that had twin engine pilots. So they went through primary, basic, and lower advanced training to be fighters. Then all of a sudden, somebody comes in one day and says, well, a certain number of you are going to be twin engine, starting out twin engine trainings. Well, I could imagine, because even in my class it caused some frustration. Because see, we were still in basic when they came up with that, and then for them to just tell us that all of you aren't going to be fighters, that was a little bit of a problem. So when my class came along, we don't know, other than some general things, as to how they decided whether we would be twin engine or single engine pilots. Now, I do know this, that the number one cadet in my class was a fellow named Sam Lynn, was a twin engine pilot. Now, you might say the cream of the crust were fighters, and we believe this now. I'm not putting fighters down. They're still my heroes. Bob and all of them. My brother was a fighter pilot. All those guys are my heroes. But the next two in my class, a fellow named Funderburg and another one named Dixon, they finished their advanced training in fighters. And a sad thing was that both of those fellows were killed overseas in my class. 43K out of the, say, 15 or 18 fighter pilots that we sent overseas, 5 were killed. And so then we went for fighters and twin engine, all except one class, and I have a picture which I'll show you later. I would like not to leave it, but if it becomes necessary, well, of my brother's class. Now, his class was 44E. Now, that meant that they finished in May of 44, not too far behind me. Mm-hmm. That class was all single engine for some reason. It may have been that they needed more single engine pilots as replacements for the 332nd, but I never knew the reason for that, but they were all single engine. But all the other classes now, from 43J on, had some twin engine pilot trainings. There was one incident that is a little bit strange, but this is factual. There was a fellow named Henry Hervey who still lives, he's in Chicago, Richard Highbaugh, and Harold Hillary. Everything in the Army was alphabetical. The three of us lined up together when we first got there. We went every place, we marched together, we were in the same group flying together. Now, Harold Hillary and I were one day flying the AT-10, which was the advanced trainer. And so I was flying at the time. It could have been my fault, but it wasn't so declared at the end of the episode. But we got a yellow light when we had started the gear down, which meant that something was wrong. Probably wasn't all the way down. To make a long story real short, a man named McPherson, who was a major by then, when the base opened, he was the captain or maybe a first lieutenant even, but the Major McPherson, came up, and actually we had a controlled mid-air collision. He said, I'm going to bump your gear forward with the wing of my airplane, which was an AT-6. Now, you remember this. You have to smile when you hear this. We were all boys, okay? I never got upset about that. But he said, now, all you boys have to do is just to fly at the airspeed I tell you, fly her straight and level, and I'll try to get your gear down. He bumped it, I would say about 4 or 5 times. He couldn't get it down. Then he pulled away from us. He told us and the tower, said they're going to fly a few more minutes to get some more of their gas out. Then they're going to make a practice approach, and he told us he wanted to make the approach beside the runway. Don't land with difficulty on the concrete, land on the grass. And we did, and the airplane touched down okay, but as she began to slow up, the gear was not functioning, so the whole front end went down and we rolled over. But believe it or not, we were not hurt. I would say, maybe a fourth, maybe less than that, an eighth or 10th of the people on the base were out there to see it, because it just took quite a bit of time for us to get rid of that air, that gas and all that. And we flopped over, and then the fireman, this was a cloth airplane, and the fireman chopped in and got us out. And so that was really a controlled thing, and it was a real positive thing to happen with an instructor. And I can also tell you this, that in primary, we had all black instructors. Chief Anderson was the chief pilot in primary. And those fellows, our class flew the PC-17. Now, some earlier than us had flown the 13, and then I think there was a 19. But we flew the 17, which once you got it up here, it was a beautiful airplane.
You said it was a positive experience with the instructor. Why was that a positive experience with the instructor?
For him trying to help us get on the ground.